Psychedelia's mission and purpose. We're a collective of professional and peers interested in the potential psychological and spiritual healing properties of psychedelics. And psychedelia events are intended for the purposes of educating about mindful and safe integration of entheogenic experiences, offering emotional support and creating meaningful connections between community members. So education, community, and support in a nutshell. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to John Saul, who is going to take it from here. John?
Thank you, guys. Hope you can hear me. It's my privilege to co-host this event. I've been wanting to do something like this for a long, long time. I've got a very close and heartfelt relationship. Dr. Phil Wolfson here. He was my MAPS therapist, 2015 and 16. So I'm going to just read his bio real quick. If I get bogged down, forgive me. But Phil Wolfson, MD, he's the creator of a new psychotherapy modality based on the use of the medicine ketamine. And it is known as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, or KAP. Phil is the CEO of the nonprofit Ketamine Research Foundation and directs the training of KAP practitioners through the Ketamine Training Center nationwide, now numbering over 300 practitioners across the US and internationally. He is the author of the Ketamine Papers, which is a book you may have seen in the MAPS library for sale. And also Noe, a father-son song of love, life, illness, and death. Available, I think, through Phil's website. I'll double check that. He's been the principal investigator for the recently completed MAPS.org phase 2 study of MDMA treatment for individuals with life-threatening illnesses. I was in that study. Dr. Wolfson's work is the result of an intense, now many decades long clinical psychiatry and psychotherapy practice. Phil is taught in the graduate psychology programs at JFK University, CIIS, and the UCSF School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. He's a graduate of Brandeis University, New York School of Medicine. He has also been a 60s activist, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, a writer, practicing Buddhist, and a psychonaut who has lived in the Bay Area for 43 years. In the 1980s, he participated in clinical research with MDMA, ecstasy. He's written and had issued 7 patents for unique herbal medicines and ketamine. Phil was the founding member of the Hefter Research Institute. We all know the Hefter Research Institute, right? He's a journalist and author of numerous articles on politics, transformation, psychedelics, consciousness, and spirit. And I will make Phil's information available in the chat. And if anyone wants more specific information, just hit me up at psychedelia.john@gmail or on Meetup. So that's the book introduction. I would just like to touch on my personal relationship a bit. Like I said, I wanted to do this for a long time. Phil means a great deal to me. I was in the MAPS MDMA assisted psychotherapy study for the treatment of anxiety due to life-threatening illness, and that was 2015 and 16. It's about an 8-month span. It was a little bit longer than the average MAPS experience because I was in the placebo group, which means I had about an extra 8 to 10 weeks at the front end, at the beginning in the placebo group, and then continued on with MDMA after that. And it saved my life. I came to Phil in very bad shape. And you know, there's a good chance I wouldn't be here today were it not for my opportunity to participate in that study. There were 18 people enrolled in that study. And it's hard for me to fathom sometimes how lucky I was being in the right place at the right time. I had a life-threatening illness and was suffering extreme depression and suicidal ideation for a long, long time. And this was my last chance to swing for the fences, and it worked for me. You know, I was on my own team. So there's important things I have that I do talks about that can highlight what made it successful. And a good deal of it is the fact that Phil Wolfson brought his entirety of his experience and practice and professionalism and heart and love into the study, where I was able to leverage that and pivot my situation about 180 degrees. Now, it's not been easy, as you know. One kind of fun anecdote that a lot of people don't know that I would like to highlight is that Phil had been friends with Alexander Shulgin, Sasha Shulgin, from about 1983 up until the time of Sasha's death. And there are more stories in there than I've heard, and it's an interesting topic. We will not be fielding questions about that topic, although in the future, I think we can plan more of a biographical talk and involve some of those fun factoids in there. So what does a guy like me say to honor and give thanks to a guy like Dr. Phil Wolfson? It can't really be put into words. So I am so appreciative of everyone taking your time to show up here and hear more stories and insights from Phil. It's kind of rare that he comes out of the clinician audience, the research audience, to talk to what I consider the mainstream psychedelic audience, or kind of like us, more mainstream than usual. And it's my honor and privilege to hand this over in this topic and this subject matter over to a man that means a great deal to me, Dr. Phil Wolfson. Thanks, Phil.
Well, I mean, that's an unbeatable introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. But there's a bit more truth to all of that, John. I mean, you've lauded me. You actually ruined our study because you were so ready. I mean, to start with a talk about set and setting seems appropriate. So you were really ready and primed to have a transformative experience. You ruined our study because you were so ready that when we didn't know you were in the placebo group, we were all blinded. You had 2 placebo sessions in a row, and you had such an important experience for yourself in opening and coming into a sense of an opportunity. I mean, you have this horrible disease that squeezes you down and does so physically and does so emotionally, makes you very tired. And, you know, it's a tough one. And, you know, your history is one of being an extraordinary athlete, a really gifted boat person. I don't know quite the name for it, but you kind of ran the bow on racing ships. And you were an amazing physical person. And then you had this experience and you came to us. You also had a really wacko childhood, and you were not so innocent, and you knew quite a bit about altered states, but you would stop those altered states. And yet you came to us in this kind of crisis, applied through the very difficult kind of process that MAPS held in order for us to bring people in. And there you were, and you were one of our first people, and you were so remarkable and different, and your heritage is different. You have Native American in you. You know, were a human of a wonderful sort, and you were primed to open your heart to yourself again. And all we did was provide the nest in a way. That's the most important thing any of us can do. And in that nest, you began to thrive. You began to say, okay, I have this horrible illness, but I'm still a human being. I'm still here. How do I make the best out of it? How do I cope with fear? How do I cope with an illness that's crushing me, that can enter my organs, excuse me, that can bring me down low, that I have to deal with in phases, because I have these moments when I'm put down and then moments when I can rebuild. And part of the rebuilding, which you continue to do, was this extraordinary output of physical energy to get yourself moving. And the enemy of your movement is the scleroderma that holds you down. And yet you were running in the morning 5 miles and 7 miles and trapezing and working out with weights. The kind of intensity that you brought and bring still to your life to stay alive in a meaningful way that was there right away. And so all we did was to give you a place in which that could revive. You ruined the study because all your measures that we were using to prove how MDMA was so effective, you were already affected in the placebo realm. So your measures had already fallen to next to zero. So we couldn't prove that MDMA was really effective for you, though we knew it was. And in the 3 succeeding MDMA sessions, you certainly came to even more life. And over the many weeks, months of being together, you achieved remarkable emotional, spiritual goals for yourself. You didn't do so good at making money. We still have to help you with making money. But you did really well on everything else. And maybe that's because money wasn't so important. And you were really trying to say, what matters to me in life? And the way I'm making money, I don't like it so much. So I'm going to change. So the whole point of that story is, life-threatening illnesses. We study them clinically. I have a personal experience with it. The reason that Rick Doblin picked me, we're old friends going back to the 80s, which we'll talk about. The reason Rick picked me is during the 80s, my mother died in January of 1984, and I had 2 boys. And 6 months later, after my mother's death, my oldest son, Noah, at near 13, suddenly had acute lymphocytic leukemia. And it was a wrestling match. He was older as a child, older than most kids who get it, and a person of very, very strong will and incredible intelligence. And he went through horror. And we had 4 years of his life, which were intense and very difficult, ending with a bone marrow transplant as a course of last resort in Seattle. Even moving there thinking he might last a little time when all the odds were against him. And then he died, and we brought him home, and he died at home. And so there was this singular experience that I had lived through during that same time when MDMA was legal and became illegal. And it figured in our lives as well. I wrote in that book you mentioned, I wrote about how we used it in our family to try and stay conscious, alive, and in some degree of quality of mind and life and happiness. 2 young kids. Health is about happiness as much as anything else. Happiness, working out like you do. But, misery is not the best friend of health. And having a terrible life-threatening illness is a miserable experience, no matter how you slice it and how you deal with that to come alive and maintain yourself. Well, MDMA is a factor in opening hearts to oneself and others. And so we use that as well. And so when it came time, there was a bequest in MAPS to create this life-threatening illness study. Rick talked to me, and I was honored to be asked to do it. And the second part of it was that I had been an MDMA practitioner in the early period of the 80s. Sasha actually was the person who introduced me and my wife, Sasha, and his wife, Ann, to the MDMA experience. I was searching for a medicine to help a young man who had been imprisoned in psychiatric overdosing with psychiatric meds. I was running an alternative hospital in Contra Costa County. And through, you asked me earlier about Leo Zeff and also Dick Price, who was co-owner of Esalen and died unfortunately in an accident, but sponsored us to have extraordinary times together of conferences at Esalen that brought together in the most remarkable ways some of the great people who you still know, most of whom are around, many of whom, like Sasha, have left us, but Andy Weil, George Greer is president of Hefter, Rick Doblin, Claudio Narano, who just died, was extraordinary Chilean origin psychologist and writer on Gestalt therapy, the Secret Chief, who you may have read about. It goes on and on. I can't even begin to tell you the number of people. We had this thing called the Association for the Responsible Use of Psychedelic Agents, ARUPA, it was called. And Dick Price would sponsor us to come down to Esalen 2 or 3 times a year in the mid-'80s, and we would hang. And new things occurred there that had never occurred before that we knew nothing about. This is basically a legal period. We have a group, a pretty large group at the time, working with MDMA and psychotherapy for myriad things. We did so many couples. There's this glow that MDMA confers, and people hang together, get married, have babies. And for some people, the glow lasts. Of course, there's that other side of MDMA, the day after, when the glow is not very strong, and it undermines people's interest in the medicine. But the glow is there, and the glow is there interpersonally and in our group at large. And probably we had about several thousand practitioners across the country using MDMA in the legal period, and trying to keep it legal and learning about it and learning about doing psychotherapy with it. I did psychotherapy with families and wrote about that, and with psychotic individuals, which was not that successful. But in any event, there was this community of experimentation. Andy Weil was in that community, and we learned about novel substances. The first ever we heard about ayahuasca occurred in that group from Claudio Naranjo, who told a wonderful story that he was really disappointed in his experience because he had hoped to see jaguars, and that's the apocryphal shaman journey. You see a jaguar comes into your journey, maybe eats you and spits you out or whatever. But poor Claudio only had an anaconda that swallowed him whole and spit him and threw him out his asshole into the world again. So poor Claudio was lamenting the anaconda story. But there were lots of things like that, and lots of cohesion, lots of beginning struggles with the regulatory agencies that were coming to bear, eventually Nixon, et cetera. And it's still kind of the formative group from which people, Stan Grof, et cetera, people, Ralph Metzner, came into being as major figures in developing psychedelic psychotherapy with various substances. Ours was, my focus, since I'm a therapist, a family systems therapist, a psychodynamic therapist, my focus was really on how to work with people, both in the state of mind of altered state and even deep altered state, but also within the integration format. So we went underground after trying to protect it in 1986. We tried to keep it open, had a hearing, a famous hearing in which the DEA's own administrative law judge found for the utility of the medicine, but the DEA overruled him and made MDMA Schedule 1, and then everything else followed, and then the analog drug law. So it became a time of great prohibition. And now we are in a time of expansion. Michael Pollan's book is seminal, but it comes years and years after the opening that people like Rick Doblin and people at Hefter and Usona and others all put together to begin to create critical studies that would prove within the clinical framework the efficacy and safety of these substances, particularly the 3 we're looking at. Ketamine, which didn't go through that because it was already legal, and we can talk about how that escaped, and MDMA, which is approaching legality, hopefully by end of 2022, early 23, and is in phase 3 trials, and psilocybin from 2 major groups that's in phase 2 studies, hopefully entering phase 3 studies, but we still don't have them. And, the trial that John was in was an 18-person trial, well described by you, John, of people mostly with cancer, many women with breast cancer, and who had less than a year of life expectancy. That didn't include you, but you were in that group because who knew what was going to happen to you? And we haven't published that study. It's supposed to come out in the next few weeks. And it was a wonderful study. So one of the aspects of that study that was so profound was just the community of people coming together, the kind of loving kindness, connection, and friendship in the work of the ketamine, of the MDMA experience. And uniquely, I'm in that house in the room next door. It was the first study ever done in someone's home. Sasha and Jack Downey, who was Larry's psychiatrist in Cuernavaca, had, with my input, we did a protocol out at Stinson Beach in the mid '80s, the first science protocol on MDMA, and that was in a house. I was in a person's house on the beach with 20 people or so. There's an interesting movie you can't get hold of, and I'm completely on the natch. And at the end of the movie, I'm saying, "Oh my God, we got to get this into the water in D.C." Well, so it's still not too late for that. So, but you know, we'll have to see about where the waters of D.C. move. Hopefully, they move in a positive direction in the next few weeks. But leaving aside all of that, very, very heady times, and then a dark period in which there was persistence and underground work in excess. So just that whole thing's interesting. So you make MDMA illegal, and you maybe have 10,000 people, 50,000 people using MDMA at the end of 1985. Comes illegal in 1986, and you have 3 million users by the end of 1987. So, you know, the war on drugs is in full force, but the war on drugs is just a war on people. It's not a war on drugs. The drugs keep coming. It's a war on people and people dealing or people using or throwing people in jail for petty amounts of having substances that they use to change their minds. So, you know, all of that expanded what I call the ground. I don't call it the underground because it's the ground from which basically all the practitioners I know of, including myself, came from. We have a program coming up for a week, and I want to tell you about it because it's a miraculous program. It starts Monday, this coming Monday. It goes till the temple burn that would have occurred in reality on Sunday the 6th. So the burn can't happen because of COVID, so can't go to Burning Man. I have this ingenious other son, now known as Helix, also Paulie Amori, who ran for mayor of Los Angeles on the Vote for Love ticket. You may have seen his red-coated ads on walls all over the place. Or he had a little TV. Garcetti managed to thrash the campaign so no one knew about anything. So Paul came in dead last. He changed his name legally so he could run on the Vote for Love ticket. Anyway, he's now Helix, and what he's put together with a crowd of people is a unique, extraordinary virtual Burning Man. And it's called the Infinite Playa, PLAYA.com. Go to the website, and it's still in the throes of construction because there's so much technical know-how going into building something where you or I can take on an identity and be on a virtual playa in whatever format we want, whatever color, whatever ethnicity. I think he's up to 46 choices. And then we're on this playa, we're an avatar, we walk around the playa, we get on phony art cars, we drive around to all the camps, and there are many camps, and it's so extraordinarily simulatory of the burn. Well, it doesn't take you there. You can't have sex in the virtual playa. You can't take drugs in the virtual playa. But what you can do in the virtual playa is really learn a lot and have a lot of fun. So the camps with music. Paul Stamets is doing a fungi presentation. We're also showing parts of the fantastic fungi. And we've created a camp called the K-Dome Microdome. Why is it microdome? Because I'm close to Jim Fadiman, and so there's a whole thing on microdosing. But we have programming starting on Monday at 10 a.m. and going till most nights till 12 midnight or even later for East Coast, West Coast reasons. And we have extraordinary educational materials, women's rights. We're very focused on trauma, which I'll talk a bit more about, and how to deal with trauma, not just in terms of psychedelic medicine, because we don't have enough trained practitioners, but in terms of the horror of these times and how we help people come together. Anyway, it's called theinfiniteplaya.com, and we are the K-Dome Microdome. It's not only about ketamine, it's about anything and everything you can imagine, with some of the most brilliant people that I know of coming in, and MAPS people. We're doing a whole session on meditation and psychedelics, which we can talk about as essential to the process of really integration with ketamine. Anyway, I know we wanted to talk a bit about life-threatening illness, and we're doing something about that. I am CEO of a nonprofit called the Ketamine Research Foundation. We are the ones sponsoring this event, and we're a nonprofit, and we do research. We began to look at ketamine and all its possibilities because it's such a wonderful medicine to use for assisted psychotherapy. And when I wrote the book, the Ketamine Papers, we have been doing hundreds of people. We've done thousands of sessions with ketamine in various ways. And we have wonderful results with people. And we do it as a psychotherapy. Most sessions are 3 hours long or so. And ketamine itself is about an hour long. The intense period, 40 minutes or so to an hour. And it's complex. And we do it as a full psychiatric psychotherapy approach to human beings with all kinds of diagnoses in all kinds of ways, because no psychedelic medicine is specific to a particular indication. That's a gimmick that's done for FDA, such as MAPS working on PTSD. It's not that MDMA is only good for PTSD. It's good for many, many things. The same is true with ketamine or ayahuasca. So in any event, we are conducting a variety of research programs. We just finished a great study. It's small, but it's so potent on ketamine's presence in breast milk, because women who have postpartum depression are either forced into using antidepressants that bathe babies in a chemical that they don't need to get, or because they're averse to using chemistry, they don't get much treatment and psychotherapy a little bit. And so ketamine as an intermittently used substance, now we know how long it lasts and how we can advise women in its use. And we're going on to create a study of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for postpartum depression. We're also doing a study that's about to start on conscious dying, conscious living. There's a long history of psychedelic substances used for people nearing death, not just the MDMA one we did, but of course the Hopkins study and the NYU study, and earlier LSD studies. And we're doing with ketamine about a month-long study of people who have a year or less to live, confronting death and all of its difficulties and all of its decisions and its myriad ways of handling it, good, bad, and indifferent. And we're doing a very integrated set of sessions, 2 sessions over a month, with psychotherapy before, during, and after, to enable people to live life during their period of time that they have left. So we're very excited about that. It's a 5-site study across the United States. So even though we're a freestanding research organization like MAPS, we are able to do research and do it with ketamine without going through FDA, because We don't need to go through FDA. We have to go through IRBs or internal review boards to make sure of the safety and quality of the studies we're performing. So that's very exciting. And the last one I'll tell you about, I'm super excited about, through our foundation, and there's a website, we're doing a thing we call Indra's Net Coalition. Indra's Net is basically an Eastern Hindu idea which says that all of us, you, John, everyone here, is a point of light connected to other points of light. And our light is internal, and our light is reflected from others into us. And, you know, we can have varying degrees of illumination. We're illuminated to the best of our ability internally, or we're not. We're dark, like some people we know we won't even mention, who we're talking tonight, who we don't even want to think about. And so they're not particularly illuminated. They're sort of dead stars in Indra's Net. But everyone's connected, including the dead stars. And everyone has a degree of illumination. So what we're doing with it is, given the limitations on the number of trained individuals able to do psychedelic psychotherapy, we're producing a thing called the Sharing Group, which is a free 6-session group, which we're going to try and do all over the world for people to get together for 6 sessions with 2 facilitators who we are paying through the foundation, with a formula for how to share. We're not doing psychotherapy. We're facilitating expression, connection, sharing of what traumas that have been experienced, and the activism and the soulfulness that comes out of that, empathy and compassion. And we're not restricting it to any particular trauma. We are doing COVID-19 trauma, first responders. We're doing Black Lives Matter trauma with people of color running that. We're internationalizing. We're going to have a group in Spain working on the awfulness of COVID-19 deaths and suppression of lives in Spain. And we're going to continue to expand it. So we hope you'll join us. Go to the website, indrasnetcoalition.org. Okay, so that's a big, long mouthful. John, you want to help me out here? Want to raise any questions?
Thank you for that. How are we spelling that URL you just described? And I'll put it in the chat.
How are we feeling about what?
Oh, how do we spell the web address you just described?
Indra, INDRASNET coalition, one word, .org. Indra's
Okay.
coalition.org. And when you go to the website, it's really beautiful. And there's some beautiful writing about connection. I hope you enjoy. And there are ways to join, to be facilitators or to be participants. It's a real attempt to say trauma's with us, terrible things are happening. How can we support each other and make for connection that's not psychedelic, but has psychedelic heart behind it, and hopefully will promote psychedelic psychotherapy and psychedelic awareness through its work. But it's primarily addressed at, all the horror that's occurring in the world, not just in the United States. We think it's a model. We're trying to create a model for sharing.
That's exciting. I put that in the chat. Paul, go ahead and type your question in the chat, and I'll field that to Phil. So we might go a little longer here, and then we'll hit some Q&A. If anyone has specific questions, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom right, and we will field those questions. My own curiosity stems from something that I'd like to highlight, which is, if there are any therapists, I'm sure there are some therapists in training on here, and some practicing clinicians, maybe underground, or as Phil says, ground. I like that. There is, we have this topic that I sort of contemplate from time to time, these boundaries in the clinical practice that are there for a reason. They're quite important. And I noticed that one thing that sort of helped me, not sort of, that very much helped me in my participation in the MAPS MDMA therapy study is, uh, and I would like to sort of bring forward that regardless of these boundaries, practicing clinicians or clinicians in training, I would hope that we sort of at large in the near future find a way to bring one's heart as a clinician, as a facilitator, bring one's love and heart into the practice. And if that starts to bend the boundaries, you know, obviously you've got to be mindful about that. But I want to mention also Julaine Andrews is my co-therapist, right? Or Phil's co-therapist in the MAP study. These two people, these two facilitators put love and their hearts so far forward in this therapy that I'm sure it bent some boundaries. And, you know, it was really okay. I'm sure it's a kind of a fine line to walk as a clinician, as a therapist, but it really made a difference. So my request is, my hope, my wish is for practicing clinicians or clinicians in training to find a way to honor the clinical boundaries, but to allow your heart and your love to go ahead and leak into the therapy. You know, I'm sure it's a fine line. I can't really talk from that side too much, but as a recipient of that, it made a huge difference.
It's really not a fine line. The line is clear, John. If you're going to do work with people, don't put your own needs in the way of that work. Don't, you know, use people for money, sex, power, self-aggrandizement. If you're really going to help people, come from a place of neutrality, of active neutrality, that you're not there to use people. Otherwise, you're confusing yourself and everyone else. And we watch those boundaries being violated, and they hurt people, they damage people, they ruin trust. Therapy is about reconstituting trust with people, because we're also damaged on the level of trust, either early on or through war or famine or accidents of birth or illness. We're also damaged in the realms of trust. And when a therapist violates that sense of trust and misuses their power or their influence, it's damaging. It damages the whole field, and it damages you know, the people involved, the therapist included. And it happens again and again. We've done a whole thing on ethics. But it brings up another very interesting question, which I'm sure your audience will be thinking about. And that is the whole question of, where is this all going? What does it really all mean? We did a panel on commercialization. There's all this money, marijuana money, et cetera, flowing into how can we make money on ketamine now? You know, and then there's all this other money flowing into pharma like psilocybin. You know, Compass is pharma doing psilocybin. USONA is nonprofit. We're nonprofit. Or we're, you know, we also do practitioner work. And that's a pretty good model if you really look at delivery of services. Michael Mithofer and I were talking about it yesterday, that, you know, we're lifelong practitioners of helping people who are suffering. And so if you break the field down and you really look at the future, there's a lot of bogus bullshit, right? So if you look at it, when you legalize MDMA, what are the costs going to be for the legalized MDMA? Well, if you're in a national health service, you may get ketamine and you may get MDMA or psilocybin available to masses of people because they're recognized and sponsored by a national health service. When you're in a for-profit insurance kind of industry, you're going to get people getting very small reimbursements, only a small number of people available, and the charges and the costs of that therapy are enormous. They're high now. We're trying to look at giving access to care, reducing costs, doing home sessions that are not charged for because they're encompassed within the training we're doing. But if we didn't do home sessions and we sent people to ketamine IV practitioners or people doing ketamine not doing home sessions, and they did the prescribed 6 sessions that is supposed to be the magic bullet for helping with treatment-resistant depression. Not quite true, but certainly in the right direction. That's a, you know, $4,000 to $6,000 investment. Very few people have it, and there's really no insurance reimbursement. There's a little bit, but insurance in America is horrible, and until we get a Medicare for all, the availability of these things are going to be limited. So you look at a legalization process. Let's take 10 years from now. We did 5 years yesterday. Let's take 5 years. And the medicines are out. You can prescribe them. And at the same time, in our imagination, let's think that medicines are legal, because the illegal thing, the money in the medical thing, on either side is corrupted. So, okay, you got someone who's going to spend $5,000 on an MDMA single session, quite possible. Let's say 3,000, right? That same MDMA, if you went to the street, it's going to be $25. Of course, you may get shit MDMA, but if you get good MDMA, it's going to be $25. And you go home and you do it with your wife, your friends, and you have a little group circle. So it's $200 for that, and you're looking at that versus the other. Where are poor people going to turn without a real process of absorption in a clinical sense, a real clinical sense, that people who are suffering need more than just an experience. They need an embedded experience of a trip with a trained person who knows about the properties of the medicine, how to do integration, what people's suffering is like, having experience with that suffering, emotional damage and trauma. You know, if you're going to have two programs that are necessity, are parallel. One's a clinical program to help with suffering. Another is a program of people wanting to have the experience, like most of us. I mean, talking to a crowd of people who mostly do their experience on their own. I don't only talk to clinical people. That's not true. I talk to people at large. Why? Because I think there's a lot of bullshit. And I think that one needs good set and setting, but one can obtain that. I've been watching people in the UK where maybe 50% of people under 50 have done ecstasy. And the evolution from rave kind of consciousness, where people did get harmed because they did too much or they didn't drink enough or they drank too much, whatever, to kind of clusters of individuals coming together as units who like to be with each other, who are socializing together. That's been the trend in the use of MDMA there, as much as I can make it out. So, you know, it's a really complex world around consciousness, what we want to experience, how we experience it. And there are these two parts to it. We need to be able to really provide some great forms of help to people who are suffering. We need to cut out the suffering also. We need to stop shooting Black people, you know. That's got to stop. You know, we need to take care of the environment, and it's out of control. We need to get vaccines and wear masks. I mean, so a lot of suffering is preventable on the smallest level of consciousness and good behavior. And then we're always picking up the pieces, right? We're picking up the pieces of poisoning the opposition in Russia. It's on and on and on and on. So we have to be activists, and otherwise we're just going to watch it continue the way it's going. And at the same time, we have to live our lives and find wonderful ways to live our lives as much as we can, even with illnesses that are so difficult to deal with, and to have the support systems so that those illnesses are held, that you're held by people who care about you and do their best to help you in hard times and in good times. That was a long rap again, too. I apologize.
Thank you, Phil. Sorry, I was muted. We have some questions building up, and I think we could hit these kind of in first come, first serve order, keeping them kind of bracketed. There's an interesting question here. It says, have any studies been done with clients diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, DID. Any studies
Well,
out, Phil?
there are no formal studies yet. There's interest. But if you take the ketamine question, it comes up a lot. Do we treat people with DID? And the answer is the dissociations of ketamine, which are powerful, are very different than the DID kind of multiple personality issues that come up. And we haven't had difficulty. We've actually had quite good repair with people, not everyone, but that the time out from being 6 different people at once or separately, and not to make light of it, by going into, and ketamine takes you out of your mind over here and puts you into an open expanse. That open expanse is often really very helpful for people to reunite and to come back. I was talking with Dick Schwartz about parts today, and we were talking about just this issue and how parts after a ketamine session or during an MDMA session are much more available. So some of what you experienced in an MDMA session, where your parts managing to come together better, not that they disappeared, but they weren't at war in the same way, or one diminished and you were able to get towards your bigger self, your higher self, your capital S self. And I think in the ketamine realm, the same happens. So, so far we have not had casualties, difficulties with DID, and I think it's a mental state that deserves attention, and we do pay attention to it. There are some specialists in it as well.
Yeah, that brings me to just highlight real quick an experience I had with you in the MDMA study, where, I kind of viewed everything through the lens of a warrior of fighting, of really grinding it out with some huge avatar. Everything is a big fight. And that includes my different parts. And so one lesson I learned in the study from you, Phil, is that, I'm an old warhorse, which is true. And I'm an old fighter, wrestler. And Phil here highlighted to me that there's a different way of fighting, and he would let me figure out what that is, and a way of fighting without killing myself and spending my vital energy while I had this life-threatening illness clamped down on me. And so that was a good lesson that I think about multiple times per week, and I utilize those lessons. It's been quite helpful. So this is kind of a related question we've got from one of our psychedelia volunteers, or maybe one of the board members. What do you feel are the advantages and disadvantages of working with psychedelics as you've described, as doing therapy during the session as an active practice? So therapy as an active practice versus the more leave the client alone with the music and nightshades method. So kind of those two fields.
That's a very good question. I have a whole slide and I'm not showing it. I think there are 2 different ways of working. And the ketamine straddles both because of its dosage qualities. But, I think working with mushrooms or LSD in early stages of LSD, I think it's appropriate to stay inside. Talking is not very useful. High dose ketamine, people are quiet, and eye shades are part of our work. And driving the experience inward to have a full experience is part of what we're trying for. So that's one stream that I think has had great power. But the second stream, which is often called, I don't like the word psycholytic, is the availability of mind for connection and for recitation and self-expression. That came out of LSD work with low dose LSD and Sidney Cohn. And we do a lot of that. We call it trance work with ketamine. And that's more direct psychotherapy, but both lead to psychotherapy because the integration experiences that we use after ketamine are really, really powerful tools. Now, a lot of people don't do that. If you went to Stan Grof, he's not going to spend time with you trying to pick up your pieces. If you did Salvador Roquette, well, they had intensives, but it wasn't so much talk therapy. It wasn't so much consciousness raising. It was experiential. And I think that's a very valid way of working, but it's a different way of working.
This question, Phil, kind of feathers in a little bit here. It says, how would you describe MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety associated with terminal illness as different from psilocybin for the same indication? Do you see the mechanisms of action as different?
I'm preferring ketamine for life-threatening illness, I must say, because it's short action and it's powerful. This lends it to it. So if we're talking about people who really have a measured life sentence, I think doing long-acting medicines like psilocybin are kind of hazardous and difficult to integrate, and they weaken people. But if we're talking about people like how you presented, John, um, I think MDMA is a remarkable experience, not as a single session, but as multiple sessions. And if people can tolerate it, I think MDMA and psilocybin, especially even together as a unit, doing MDMA, psilocybin as one, provides the benefits of both the heartfulness and openness of ketamine, and some of that comes from psilocybin and mushrooms, and the experience of an altered state of great proportions, which really, like ketamine, remodels a sense of who one is and opens doors to being out of one's usual self and to a whole new experience of mind, imagination, etc. So I think there's a lot of bullshit about which drug is better. That's kind of corporate pharmacism that comes out of, who's got the better drug? Can I get more money than you? I think they're different, and the ways in which we use them need to mirror our sense of who people are and their tolerances and what works for them best and their situations, as well as the particular properties of the substances. But substances are not that unitary. Use this one for that, use this one for that. I was having a talk with Scott Shannon, and I said to him, you're getting a little particular with your QMRIs. Are you going to invent a DSM for psychedelics? So here you go. You got that, you take this. You got that, you take this. I don't think he's going to do that, so I take him out of the firing line. But I think that's bullshit. I think that what we're doing is really working with the hearts and souls of people, and we're using medicines in various ways to achieve a better integration of people in living in this world, doing better with themselves, not being in so much suffering and agony, and doing better in relationship.
Excellent. So I've got something, thank you, Phil. Makes sense. So what happens to someone like me? Here's a question that popped up that's kind of related to the one I was just going to field. Okay, this is good. I'll just field this question, not in lieu of mine, I'll delay mine. It says, hi friends, I have type 1 diabetes, a life-threatening but not terminal illness. Is there much to say around psychedelic therapy for long-term chronic illness?
Huge amounts to say about safety. I'm working with someone with type 1 diabetes. It depends, how difficult your situation is. Of course, you want to control your insulin, but it also depends where you are in it. So would you treat someone who had peripheral vascular disease with diabetes with a mind-altering substance? I don't see why not. The issues are safety, and these in general are very, very safe substances. So if you're working with mind, we've done quite a bit of work with people even with brain tumors, and we've done work with people who are coming to the end of their lives with pancreatic cancer. So it's a question really of the availability of mindfulness. So it's pointless to do psychedelic substance with people who don't have enough mind to benefit from it. There are arguments that you can change mood. There was a study in San Diego in a hospice doing daily ketamine for people who were really Alzheimer's, and may have improved their mood a little. But I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in how do we help people live conscious lives consciously and connectedly. So I don't think chronic illness, I think you take it one by one. Some of the drugs are more cardiotoxic. Ketamine routinely raises blood pressure, and so does MDMA and heart rate, but so does marijuana, especially heart rate. And some people can't tolerate them and shouldn't tolerate them. You don't want to treat someone with a stroke potential who will have a higher blood pressure, a higher chance of a hypertensive crisis. So, that's part of the art of having physicians work with you when you have a chronic illness. But in general, these substances are safe.
Thank you. So, what is it what happens to a person like me who gets a life-threatening diagnosis? For example, the diagnosis I got was, oh, there's no cure for what you've got. We chase the symptoms and we kind of mitigate the symptoms along the way. As I learned, it's quite a painful disease, but somebody else could get something else like lupus, fibromyalgia, MS, something like that. What happens to the emotional and the spiritual? What happens to the psyche? What happens to the soul when one is confronted that typically? What are we dealing with, and then how do these medicines and therapies help us transcend that part of it and sort of, it's hard for me to explain because the overlap between physical pain and emotional strife, emotional dissonance was indiscernible. And I noticed that if I helped one end, the other one would follow, and didn't matter which direction I went. But I generally like to start with my body feeling better first, and then coming into, and then my mental state will follow. So what happens to someone like me that gets a life-threatening diagnosis or sort of chronic illness? You've got a long-term thing to deal with, and your life's going to kind of get altered very drastically. How would you describe, Phil, how that?
Well, I think, John, that's a really complex question because it's a human being who is confronted with the reality of coming towards a cessation of their life. And that human being has a history, has relationship aspects, has intimacy issues, has financial issues, has dependency issues, has, career issues, has who's going to be with me, has issues of sexuality and relationship. And am I going to be loved in my illness? Am I going to be abandoned in my illness? Who's going to take care of me? I wrote extensively on this because I think it's a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, which we haven't really listed yet as a life-threatening illness, PTSD. And so there is both the past and what you bring to something. I mean, you bring extraordinary physical force to your illness. So your approach to it was unlike probably almost anyone else in the scleroderma world, which was to say physical activity, keeping my body limber, doing whatever I can to keep myself lubricated, and exercising to keep away organ damage, to keep my heart going. You took that on, and you had a long history of knowing that physical activity, that even competitive activity, was beneficial to your body, and so you embrace that. Many other people are not going to have that as an internal resource. You also took on issues of where am I going with finance, and that entered into your whole view of what was going to happen in your illness. So it's very hard to separate out what the illness factors are. We have a new thing we're doing called the end of life inventory, which tries to help us look at the whole composite nature of what you bring with yourself into an illness, how you're reacting to a death sentence, and how ketamine may help you with that. And it's many questions about spirit and life and resources. And sometimes the pain is just too great, and the suffering is too great, and you want to die. You want to say, okay, I've had enough. I can't do it anymore. And that's legitimate. So I don't have a unitary answer. I would say that we're creating a huge population, a huge population of survivors in this world who have been through all kinds of treatment, have survived cancers, but have been humbled by the treatment, humbled by the disability, weakened by the whole process, unsure of where to go with their lives, feeling betrayals or confusion, or who's with me, or this one left me and wasn't there when I was doing this, or the chemotherapy really fried my brain. I don't know where the fuck I am anymore, or what I can do, or how I revive. So, we've been focusing on that as a real issue for people. That is, from the diagnosis through the treatment, there is a traumatic process of varying degrees. And some people end up with a full PTSD kind of complex. You saw people in our study. A lot of what we were working on was just that, the damage done by the treatment itself, the residues of the treatment, where you're left with. So people are often left with scarred bodies, less organs, chronic illnesses, and have to cope with that. And how do you come back? And you're in a society which gives you very little money to survive on. You're suddenly dependent on parents or children. The complexity of the whole thing of survival is huge, and there isn't a single answer. And bringing into that psychedelics, well, the psychedelics need to come in a way in which people are embraced by family too. We, as you know, in the study, brought in collaterals, people who were in your life, a woman, a man, your husband, your wife, your parents, because everyone's involved. And we have this silly notion that this is a thing just affecting you, when it's not just affecting you. It's affecting me talking to you right now. My love for you is affected in all this. But you have much deeper relationships that are affected. What do you do with a relationship? Do you say, I'm going to be a wreck and I don't want to lean on you and I really think you should go find someone else who's not sick? Or do you say, I need you, I want you, are you going to stick with me? I'm dying, I did all this for you. Well, aren't you going to be there for me? And there's this whole range of emotions that open up around illness and how we are and how we're going to be and what's going to happen to us, and terrible fear. And how do we make peace with dying? Okay, you got a year left to live. Okay, what are you going to do with that year? Stephen Levine wrote a nice book, A Year Left to Live. Push came to shove. Stephen got some terrible illnesses. He lived terribly for 3-4 years. I knew him quite well. He lived terribly. He didn't know how to do it because the affliction was harder than the imagination of the affliction. The difficulty of the survival, the pain, the suffering, the limitation. I'm watching someone who I love deeply who is losing part of his mind. And he's only 70. And he's a knocker, as we say in the Jewish world, a guy who's had tremendous presence, right? A real knocker. And he's feeling his limitations, and he's still pretty there. But for him, the fine tuning is evaporating. And as the fine tuning evaporates, life doesn't have much pleasure. He's anhedonic. So you have to deal with pleasure also in all this. That's a very long answer, but I think you deserve that answer because I'm in the same boat. I'm 76. How do I make peace with limited time? What are my aspirations? How far do I want to go? What's of value to me? And I'm relatively healthy, but I can't run anymore. I walk very badly. So, these things are so complicated, and what we deserve really is dialogue and conversation and being able to express ourselves like you're trying to do in your work and your open dialogues with people in the group work you're trying to do. You're trying to foster a sense of expression. Talk to me, baby, talk to me. Let's talk together. Let's hear about your story. Let's tell my story. Let's see what we get out of it together. Let's see how we share, and in that sharing, how do I grow? What do I learn? How do I learn about how to cope or how not to cope or what I want, what's left. And today is different than tomorrow. And tomorrow could be a shitty day. and my skin could come down and crack me down. And then I got to pull it open again. And I've done that 20 times. I had a kid who did that. Okay, my son did that. So he'd go into chemotherapy, right? He'd become a skeleton. He'd become gray, mangled, lose his hair. And he's a teenager. He hates it, right? And as soon as the chemo would stop and the madness of the steroids would stop, he'd start lifting weights. He'd put on Springsteen. We got more great music out of him. And he'd start lifting weights. And he'd say, I don't want to be that. And then he'd be knocked down again because the treatment would take him apart again. And then he'd have to pick his ass up again. And he did it again and again, but he was 13, 14, 15, 16. And he had periods where he just couldn't. He just couldn't. But until the very end, he said, I had one goal, I want to live. But he's a kid. What else do kids want to do? They don't want to say, oh, I'm ready to die, right? So, young people, you're a young guy, relatively speaking. A part of you says, look, I'm pretty healthy. Why the fuck do I want to die? How do I live my life? So this is extraordinarily difficult, complex, interesting, and a subject that we all should be sharing, right? Because we're all facing it. Whatever arises, ceases. We all face it.
Beautiful. Absolutely. And that brings forward several moments in my experience where it was you made it clear too. It looks like you're choosing life, John. So yeah, in fact, there's several instances during the therapy where I came to a fork in the road and chose life. And then the result of choosing life, it seemed like choosing the other way, checking out or asking for a do-over or getting out of here, seemed kind of a attractive resignation, a comforting way to go. And then choosing life, I sort of had an overwhelming feeling that it's going to be really friggin' hard, which it was and is. Not so much anymore, but it was really overwhelming in terms of choosing life, and then, oh shit, look what that means. And that means a lot of uncomfortable decisions, actions, and just emotional states. But then, that becomes, obviously, as you kind of progress, that becomes what is sweet about life. That agony, that duress becomes something that is as sweet as anything else. Weirdly.
You look at your life force, which changes, your life force changes. So a question I might ask you, John, is how long could you stay in bed before you just turned off by being in bed? Some days you have to sleep. I mean, I have vertigo, and there are days when I have to sleep, for 16 hours, and I hate it, but I don't have a choice because the vertigo doesn't let me really function. But how long could you really stay in bed, being who you are? Could you do 12 hours? You do 16? When are you kicking yourself in the ass and saying, oh, what the fuck am I doing? I don't really want to do this.
I remember I was relegated to a beanbag chair or bed for 3.5 years. And I had the company of opiates, Percocet, 10-325s were my way kind of through that. And they helped. But that said, I was at the end. I would go out and work and meet clients, but I had to talk myself into it in the conversation.
It's hard, right? It was really hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were parts of times when you wanted to just say, okay, it's too hard, fuck it, right?
Yeah. And so I tell this story sometimes is that, all of my mental toughness was burned up. That fuel was gone. All of my kind of spiritual reserves burned up, gone. And the only thing that was left at the end, interestingly enough, was vanity. So, hey man, that walk in the woods with a shotgun isn't going to be a good look. So let's go one more day. So my vanity kind of carried me through until I found the MDMA therapy. So it's interesting the way things work like that. And then
Life
the love
force
and
is
hope.
very interesting. And some things we do, like the opiates, really, while they help us not have pain, they cripple the life force. They just undercut the life force.
For sure they do. And so to experience my baseline pain levels, which I'd never experienced without opiates and without my brain used to making its own pain reliever, was pretty daunting. And that was my ticket, my admission ticket into the study, was that
And you
cold
did it.
turkey.
You did it really, really consciously. It was hard, and yet you persevered. And you put exercise in its place. You put movement in its place. And
I
so
did.
you found something really important. You're a teacher to others of that.
Thank you. It's my honor to be so. So we do. I think we've addressed the core topic here pretty thoroughly, and thank you for that, Phil.
Do we
I
have
love you,
more
man.
time? We have.
We've got a couple of questions.
Okay, I'll do my best.
We're gonna have, yeah, because we're going to be done by. We could either finish between now and 7:30. Let me field a couple of quick questions, off topic a little bit. This is from one of our. This is from our former ops manager. So from Phil, from a therapist and training perspective, are there particular training programs that you'd recommend that are appropriate for graduate students? And can you say a little about what to look for in a training program, especially for students of limited financial means who might not have access to the total range of options available?
It's a very good question, a very difficult one. So what do you mean by training? You're in a graduate program. Let me get a little more honed down. You're doing a graduate program and you wonder what trainings you might partake of?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Training programs that are appropriate or for graduate students.
In psychedelic psychotherapy?
Yeah, yep.
So, the range is broad. So obviously CIIS runs with Janice Phelps a training program that people are attracted to, most of whom have degrees. It's getting more experiential. It's a weekend program. People in those clusters have a very good time together. So I would investigate and see if that program suits you. Hokomi has had a wonderful long history for people who didn't have degrees, HOKOMI, if I remember right. That's another one. It depends on what your question is about. What do you want to get trained in? Because of the illegality, there is no particular training program and how can I do this or that. The MAPS programs with MDMA probably offer the most strong training in how to do MDMA. Our program with ketamine, once we can overcome COVID, is the best program and most thorough and ongoing. We have an organization of members who are practicing with ketamine. That's an ongoing support program internationally, small but growing. That's a great training program and an ongoing support program. There are underground programs and underground practitioners offering programs. I can't speak to the quality of those. Some are expensive, some are worthwhile. And then there is the acquisition of skills by working with people, which is probably your best shot. So you train people who you want to work with. I did over the course of my life. And you learn skills by being with people as interns or just co-therapists or whatever, or participation. Participation is one of the great trainers of all time. Being the subject of something rather than the teacher of something is essential. We put that into our ketamine training. MAPS has it for the most part, but no force into their MAPS training. So our ketamine training requires people to do the medicine and the two formats of trance and transformation, because we don't believe that taking a powerful substance without knowing it for yourself, we don't believe you should administer a powerful substance without knowing it for yourself. And because we do a group training, people have a very large experience of what the effects of ketamine are in a group of 30 people. So that's practitioner based. So I think I've covered most of it. I think you learn over time. People get into a rush. I got to get this one, that one, next one, and I got to get it all down. Well, it don't work that way. There's also the training of spirit, the training of meditation, the training of alternative medicines, functional medicines, acupuncture, you name it. There's training of yoga. I'm too old for yoga. I reached it too late. But I think yoga is a great mental training. So I think putting disciplines together that really shape your capacity to be with yourself and to understand others is various. There's no rush. You ain't going to get there that fast. Have the patience of saying, I'm learning, experiencing, I want to integrate it. I don't want to squeeze it all together,
Very good. Thank you, Phil. What's the URL for your ketamine clinician training program?
You can find it all under ketamineresearchfoundation.com. ketamineresearchfoundation.com. Within that, there's a ketamine training center. Don't send me any notes right now, please, because we can't get a training going with COVID yet. But we're going to advertise as soon as we can get space that can hold us. And then there's within that Ketamine Psychotherapy Associates. And we have a wonderful library. If any of you are doing research, go to the Ketamine library under our Ketamine Research Foundation. Full text is available. All human studies are there. And then there's research to look at. And I encourage you to look at Indra's Net Coalition. That's a great way if you want to get training because you're going to be able to be part of something that's a miracle that's going to happen in the world. I certainly hope so.
Wow, that's nice. So there's a couple of people that just want to say hi. I think it'd be great. Peter Taubkin, old friend of yours. Hi, Phil. I want to thank you for making a big difference in my life. I'm grateful beyond words. And that's Peter Taubkin. Also, Joseph D. Thank you eternally, Phil, for the work that you've done.
I haven't talked to you in a while, Peter. Good to hear your voice. I hope things are good with you. You're still in LA, I assume, and love to see you.
He is. He's my weightlifting buddy, and currently the gym is closed. Very sad about that. Another gentleman, Joseph D, says, thank you eternally for all the work you've done, Dr. Wolfson, a pioneer in the field of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and professional inspiration. We truly stand on the shoulders of giants, yours among them. I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, thank you. Those are very supreme, undeserved comments, really. I got old.
Yeah, we want to hear all the stories. We want to hear all the stories.
All the stories, right?
So yeah, there's some good ones. And so I'm grateful I'm alive.
I'll tell you Sasha's story as
please, yeah.
Conclusion. I told you, Richard. So Sasha and Ann gave me my first journey with MDMA, and it wasn't my first journey in general, but it was the first one with them. And for a little while, at the end of the program, I was in the research group, which tested new substances as Sasha would make them. Sasha had a real program. He'd started out at low dose with himself, work his way up. If he didn't die, get sick, or have a convulsion, and he thought there was a good property, he would advance it. Then he would give it to Anne, who came to him somewhat later in life. And then he had a small group of people who were called the researcher group. And I came to it very late. I only had a few experiences. It was disbanding. But we started making ketamine together. MDMA together. And Sasha taught me how to make MDMA, and we make it in his lab. And we made quite a bit of it. It was legal. And I was a California physician. And he had the license to manufacture, probably not in the quantities he did, but I had the license as a California physician to make and distribute medicines. That's part of being a California physician. only these were not controlled substances, so I could do it. So I was kind of a figurehead in the lab, and we'd work it out, and we'd spend a day, and we'd make boku amounts of pure MDMA. Okay, so then where would it go? He had this little jar on his shelf that was labeled Phil's MDMA. And it was a jar like this. It probably had about, it was probably about 12 ounces of MDMA, which, it's a lot of MDMA. Never got stolen. We weren't selling MDMA. We were never, ever in the money economy. Sasha got supported by donations. He didn't deal. I never dealt. But we had this jar. And Sasha's house and lab was a place of great frequency. People would come and go, and there would be parties, and God knows who would come to those parties. You never knew if it was a DEA agent or if it was some lovely kind human. But anyway, there was this bottle on the shelf, and I think we only made 2 batches. But that bottle, it was like, it's sort of like the Hanukkah story, where the oil lasts for 8 days when it's only supposed to last for 1, so the Jews can have the sacraments in their temple, the eternal light going. And we had the eternal Phil's bottle of MDMA. And it was there for years, being filled up again and again. I would come and say, what the hell? No one's been here? No one's taken any? And he would laugh and I would laugh. And it would be just, that we were helping people to really have that experience. Well, that's a little story.
That's a good one. Thank you for that, Phil.
You're welcome.
I think we've run.
We've run out of time, I hope.
Yeah. And maybe Paul Antico could get back on board and close this out. I just want to thank you, Phil, from my heart. Again, words don't say what it deserves. So thank you for coming aboard and sharing some stories with us and sharing
You're my brother.
OG
my
therapist.
brother.
I call it the OG crowd. We'll talk soon. All right, Paul Antico, you want to close this out a bit here?
And let me just thank the crowd for listening and thank you for honoring me by being here. Much appreciated.